My wife's voice was so thin I barely recognized it. "Don't hang up," she whispered. Behind her, Emma was pacing the living room, eyes wide and glassy. "He knows. Victor knows. And he's coming for us tonight." I don't know what he found. Outside our kitchen window, a car engine idled across the street, low, patient, like something waiting to pounce. It sounded like a warning shot. "Diane," I said, forcing my voice steady, "put me on speaker. And don't say another word. Not one." She swallowed hard. "He's out on parole. 3 weeks ago. The DNA test, it wasn't supposed to come to you like this." Then she said the sentence that turned my stomach to ice. "They're coming to take her. He says she's his." As she spoke, my mind snapped back to the moment this started. The moment I learned my entire life was built on a secret so dark it kept me chained. 7 days earlier, on a cold February morning, the mail arrived at 10:17 a.m. A plain white envelope from a law firm I'd never heard of. I stood in the foyer with my coffee going cold, staring at it like it belonged to someone else. Inheritance notification. A distant uncle I barely remembered leaving a small property and cash. Routine, they said. Just sign and return. I opened it anyway. Tucked inside was a court-ordered background check attachment, and a single line that stopped my heart. Paternity probability, 0%. Before I could even breathe, Diane appeared in the doorway, face pale as ash. "Thomas, don't read that without me." 3 dots of panic in her eyes. Then another envelope arrived the next day. No return address. Just one word handwritten across the front. Soon. Clean. Cold. Absolute. The year was 2006, but the memory feels like it happened this morning. I can still see the way the light hit the kitchen table, making the wood grain look like ripples in a dark pond. Diane sat across from me, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She was pregnant just a few months along, and the joy we should have felt had been replaced by a heavy, cold fog. I reached out to take her hand, but she pulled away. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry glass. "There is something you don't know. Something so bad it will change how you look at me forever." I waited, my heart thumping against my ribs. I thought maybe she had a debt or a past love she couldn't forget. But the words that came out of her mouth were like a physical blow to my chest. She looked me in the eyes and told me a lie that would steal the next 20 years of my life. She said that through a secret she had buried for years, I was not just her husband, but her own biological father. She wove a story of hidden family shame and a past I couldn't remember, making the baby in her womb a symbol of a crime that didn't exist. The revulsion hit me first. It was a sick, oily feeling that rose up in my throat. I wanted to run out of the house and never look back. I wanted to scream that it was impossible. But Diane was so good at the act. She sank to the floor, sobbing, telling me she had no one else in the world. She told me that if I left, she and the baby would be outcasts. She made me feel like I was the only one who could carry this cross. She turned my natural desire to be a good man into a heavy chain of duty. Slowly, the horror turned into a numb, reluctant commitment. I looked at her shaking shoulders and decided right then that I would be the shield. I would swallow the shame and live in the shadows if it meant the child would have a home. We began to pull away from the world that day. We stopped calling friends and skipped family dinners. We built a high wall around our little house, living in a quiet isolation that felt like a prison. I thought I was protecting a daughter from the truth of her birth, never knowing I was actually being guarded like a prisoner by the woman I loved. The foundation of our family was set in stone that afternoon, but the stone was made of sand and lies. The years that followed were like walking through a thick fog. To the outside world, we were just a normal couple starting fresh, but inside our house, every brick was laid on a foundation of secrets. I decided to quit my construction job. The long hours and the traveling felt too risky now that I had to guard our home every single minute. I traded the hard hats and loud machines for a steady office job in a quiet suburb where nobody knew our names. I wanted a life that was invisible. I wanted a place where the air was still and nothing ever changed. When Emma was finally born, the weight of my duty became a physical thing. I remember holding her for the first time in the hospital. She was so small and perfect, with tiny fingers that curled around my thumb. In that moment, the revulsion I felt from Diane's story moved to the back of my mind. It didn't matter whose blood I thought was in her veins. All that mattered was that she was mine to protect. Her birth cemented my role as the family shield. I wasn't just a husband anymore. I was a soldier standing at the gate of a kingdom built on a lie. We moved into a house with a white fence and a big oak tree in the front yard. On the surface, it was a dream, but the cracks were always there if you looked closely. Diane changed after we moved. She became a woman of locked doors and closed curtains. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night to find her sitting straight up in bed, her eyes wide and staring at the bedroom door. She had terrible nightmares that left her shaking and covered in sweat. Whenever I asked her what was wrong, she would just squeeze my hand until it hurt. "It's just a past, Thomas," she would whisper, her voice trembling. "It's the secret. It never truly leaves you." I dismissed her anxiety as trauma from the dark family history she had described. I thought she was just afraid of the shame leaking out into our new, clean life. I didn't see the way she checked the rearview mirror every time we drove to the grocery store. I didn't think twice about why she insisted on extra deadbolts on every door. I told myself I was being a good, supportive husband by not asking too many questions. I thought I was helping her heal, but really, I was just helping her hide the truth. We were building a beautiful life, but we were building it on shifting sand. As Emma grew, the house filled with the sounds of a happy childhood, but my mind stayed trapped in a dark place. Every milestone she reached felt like a bittersweet victory. I cheered at her soccer games and clapped at her school plays, but I always stood at the very back of the crowd. I became an expert at being invisible. When other parents talked about their family trees or where their ancestors came from, I would suddenly find a reason to walk away. I couldn't risk anyone asking me a question I wasn't prepared to answer. The lie Diane told me had turned my own history into a minefield. I started avoiding mirrors in our house. Every time I caught a glimpse of my own reflection, I didn't see a proud father. I saw a man carrying a secret that made him feel sick to his stomach. I would look at Emma's bright smile and then look at my own face, searching for a resemblance that I was terrified to find. The shame was a constant weight, like carrying a heavy stone in my pocket every single day. I felt like a fraud, a man playing a role in a movie where the script was written in a language I hated. One Tuesday afternoon, I found myself sitting in my car in front of a small office building downtown. I had seen a sign for a therapist who helped people with family stress. My hand was on the door handle, and my heart was racing so fast it hurt. I wanted to tell anyone, about the fog I was living in. I wanted to ask if a man could ever truly be clean again after hearing what I had heard. I needed to know if I was doing the right thing by staying, or if I was just helping a lie grow bigger and stronger. But as I looked at the glass door of the office, a wave of cold fear washed over me. What if the therapist had to report me? What if the secret got out and the police showed up at our front door? I thought about Emma's innocent face and how her world would shatter if the walls of our perfect life came tumbling down. I couldn't be the one to pull the thread that unraveled everything. I pulled my hand back, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. I told myself that being a protector meant suffering in silence. I didn't realize that by hiding the cracks in our facade, I was letting the whole structure rot from the inside out. The mail arrived on a Tuesday, just like any other day. I was standing in the kitchen, still wearing my work shirt, when I pulled a thick, white envelope from the pile. It was from a law office, something about a small property left behind by a distant relative. I thought it was just boring legal talk until I saw the words background check and DNA profile in bold letters. I sat down at the wooden table, my heart starting to pound. I scanned the lines, and then I saw it. The paper said there was a 0% chance that I was related to the child I had raised for 20 years. The world seemed to stop moving. I looked at the sink, the coffee pot, and the familiar walls of our home, but everything felt strange. Diane. I called out, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. She walked into the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. When she saw the paper in my hand and the look on my face, her skin turned a sickly shade of white. "Thomas, what is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I shoved the paper across the table. I didn't have words yet, just a hot, burning fire in my chest. She looked at the results, and her eyes filled with tears instantly. She didn't deny it. Instead, she started to sob, covering her face with her hands. "I was trying to protect us," she cried. "I did it for Emma. I did it so we could be a family." "Protect us from what?" I barked, standing up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You told me a story so horrible I lived in shame for 2 decades. You made me believe I was her father and her grandfather at the same time." "Why?" Diane shook her head, her breath coming in short, panic gasps. "You don't understand how dangerous he is. If you hadn't stayed, Victor would have found us sooner. He would have taken her." I froze. "Victor?" I asked, the name tasting like poison. "Who is Victor?" She stopped crying for a split second, her eyes going wide as she realized she had said too much. She tried to take the name back, spinning a new web of words about old friends and mistakes, but the spark was already lit. For 20 years, I had been the shield, but now I realized I was just a pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing. The woman I loved was a stranger, and the monster she feared finally had a name. I didn't know who Victor was yet, but I knew my life would never be the same again. I didn't tell Diane about the man I met in the dim corner of a local diner. His name was Miller, a private investigator with tired eyes who didn't ask too many questions. I handed him a small envelope of cash and the name that was burning a hole in my mind. Victor Kane. For 3 days, I went to work and came home, acting like a man who wasn't falling apart. I watched Diane across the dinner table. She looked smaller, her olive-toned skin pale, and her hands constantly twisting her wedding ring. I felt a cold knot in my stomach every time our eyes met. When Miller finally called me back to the diner, he pushed a thick manila folder across the cracked table. "It isn't pretty, Thomas," he said quietly. I opened the report, and the words felt like jagged glass. Victor Kane wasn't just an old boyfriend. He was a monster. The report detailed a long history of violence. He had been arrested multiple times for stalking and terrible physical assault. The victim in every case was Diane. I read about the night he was finally sent to prison. He had tried to kidnap her, promising that if he couldn't have her, no one would. He was sentenced to 20 years in a high-security cell. My breath caught as I looked at the bottom of the page. He had been granted parole just 2 weeks ago. He was out, and he was free to walk the same streets we did. Suddenly, the last 20 years made a terrible kind of sense. I saw Diane's life as a series of frantic choices made in total fear. She hadn't just lied to be mean or greedy. She had looked at a kind, steady construction worker, and saw a fortress. She had invented that horrible family secret because she knew a man like me would never abandon a child he thought was his own blood. She had used my heart to build a wall between her daughter and a predator. I sat there for a long time, staring at Victor's mugshot. His gray eyes were cold and empty, the eyes of a hunter. I felt a wave of hot anger at Diane for stealing my truth and wasting my years on a fake story. But beneath the anger, I felt a sharp, painful pity. She had lived every single day waiting for a knock on the door that finally came. I wasn't her father, and I wasn't Emma's biological dad, but I was the only person standing between them and the man in that folder. My hands stopped shaking as I closed the report. The betrayal hurt, but the danger was real. I had to decide if I was still the protector she thought I was. The sun began to set behind the trees, but the light didn't feel warm anymore. It felt like a warning. A few days after I read that terrible report, things started to change around our house. It began with the sound of Diane's phone buzzing on the granite counter. Every time a message arrived, she would jump as if she had been shocked. One afternoon, I saw her looking at a text message with her face full of pure fear. I didn't have to see the screen to know what it said. The hunter had found her. Victor was sending shadows into our bright, clean life. Later that evening, I stood by the front window and pulled the curtain back just an inch. Across the street, a dark car sat under a broken street lamp. The engine was off, and the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see the driver. It just sat there, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. My hands clenched into fists. I looked at the extra deadbolts on our door and wondered if they were enough to keep a monster out. Emma came into the room, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She was 20 now, but in that moment, she looked like the little girl I used to carry to bed. She looked at Diane, who was nervously twisting her gold necklace until her neck was red. Then she looked at me. "Dad, what is going on?" she asked, her brown eyes full of confusion. "Mom hasn't eaten all day, and you keep staring out the window like you're waiting for a storm. Is someone sick?" I looked at her heart-shaped face and felt a sharp pain in my chest. For 20 years, I had believed a lie to protect her innocence. Now, I had to tell a new lie to keep her from feeling the terror that was closing in on us. I forced my face to stay calm and reached out to pat her shoulder. "Everything is fine, honey," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "Your mom is just a little stressed about some old family business. And I'm just making sure the neighbor's cat isn't digging up our garden again." It was the first time I had ever lied to her. It felt like lead in my stomach. Emma didn't look like she believed me, but she nodded and went to her room. As soon as she was gone, the silence in the house felt heavy and cold. I looked back at Diane, whose eyes were glassy with tears. We were trapped in a cage of our own making, and the shadows outside were starting to creep under the door. The air in the kitchen felt heavy and cold as Thomas and Diane stood on opposite sides of the room. The silence was broken only by the sound of Diane's shaky breathing. Thomas held the private investigator's report in a tight grip, his knuckles white. "We have to tell her, Diane," he whispered, his voice thick with a mix of anger and fear. "Emma needs to know why a strange car is parked outside our house. She needs to know why you're jumping at every shadow." Diane shook her head frantically, her hazel eyes wide with tears. "No, Thomas. If we tell her everything, it will destroy her. She's 20 years old. You can't just tell her that her whole life is a lie built on a story about a monster." She stepped closer, her hands reaching out in a pleading gesture. "Let's just tell her about Victor. We can say he is a dangerous man from my past who is back to cause trouble. We don't have to mention the paternity. Not yet." Thomas looked at the woman he had loved for 2 decades. The betrayal burned in his chest, but he saw the pure terror on her face. He knew that Emma's world was fragile. If they told her he wasn't her biological father right now, while a predator was circling the house, she might completely fall apart. "Fine," he finally said, his voice sounding hollow. "We tell her about the danger." But no more lies after that. When Emma walked into the room, she could feel the tension like a physical wall. Her heart-shaped face was full of worry. Thomas and Diane sat her down and explained that a man named Victor, someone Diane knew a long time ago, was back and might be dangerous. They told her to be careful, to lock her doors, and to call them immediately if she saw anything strange. Emma looked back and forth between them, her brown eyes full of deep confusion. "Just an old boyfriend?" she asked, her voice small. "Why does it feel like there is something much bigger you aren't saying?" Diane looked away, but Thomas forced himself to hold Emma's gaze. The guilt felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. Emma stood up and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his neck in a tight hug. "It's okay, Dad," she whispered against his shoulder. "I'm not scared as long as you're here. You've always been the one who keeps us safe. You're the best dad anyone could have." Thomas closed his eyes, his heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. She was affirming him as her father, completely unaware of the truth he was hiding. He held her back, his arms shaking, realizing that the lie was no longer just Diane's. It was now his, too. He was her protector, but he was also the man keeping her in the dark. The sun was shining on the college campus, but for Emma, the air suddenly felt ice cold. She was walking to the library when a tall man with a scarred face stepped into her path. He didn't look like a student or a teacher. He wore a heavy leather jacket and had eyes as gray and hard as stones. He didn't yell or grab her. He just stood there with a scary, crooked smile. "You have your mother's eyes," the man said, his voice sounding like gravel rubbing together. "But that stubborn chin, that comes from me." It's amazing how much a person can see of themselves in a stranger, isn't it? Emma's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't know who this man was, but a wave of pure terror washed over her. He looked at her with a look that was both hungry and mean. "I don't know you," she managed to whisper, her voice shaking. "Not yet," the man replied, stepping closer. "But we have 20 years of catching up to do, little bird. Go home and ask your daddy about the man who really gave you that face." Emma didn't wait to hear another word. She turned and ran as fast as her legs could carry her, her backpack bouncing against her spine. She didn't stop until she was locked inside her dorm room. With trembling fingers, she pulled out her phone and called the only person she trusted to save her. Back at the house, Thomas was in the garage when his phone buzzed. Hearing Emma's sobbing voice on the other end changed him in an instant. The stoic, calm man who usually thought before he moved was gone. When she told him about the man with the gray eyes and the leather jacket, Thomas felt a cold, sharp resolve snap into place. "Stay locked in your room, Emma," Thomas said, his voice deep and rough with a fear he couldn't hide. "I am coming right now. Do not open the door for anyone but me." He ran to his truck, his limp from his old injury forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. As he tore down the driveway, he caught a glimpse of Diane standing in the doorway, her face full of guilt and sorrow. He didn't stop. His mind was focused only on the girl who called him Dad. He didn't care about the DNA results or the 20 years of lies anymore. He only knew that a wolf was at the door, and he was the only thing standing in the way. For the first time in his life, Thomas wasn't just a protector out of duty. He was a father out of pure, raw love, and he was ready to do whatever it took to keep his daughter safe. The next morning, the air felt thick and heavy as I walked into a tall glass building downtown. I was there to meet a lawyer named Mr. Reed. I sat in a big leather chair and laid out all the papers the investigator had given me. I told him about Victor Kane and the way he had followed Emma. My voice was steady, but my inside felt like a tangled ball of yarn. Mr. Reed looked at the evidence of Victor's violent past and nodded. He told me we could file for a restraining order to keep Victor away from our house and Emma's school. It felt good to finally have a legal shield, but I knew a piece of paper might not stop a man like Victor. While I was out, a plain white envelope was slid under our front door. Diane found it first. She opened it with trembling fingers and read the words inside. It was a letter from Victor. He didn't call Emma by her name. He called her his daughter. He wrote that he had been robbed of 20 years and that he was coming to take back what belonged to him. Diane didn't show me the letter right away. She tried to hide it in a kitchen drawer, but I saw the tear stains on her cheeks the moment I walked in. When she finally handed it to me, the anger I felt was like a hot fire, but it was mixed with a cold, hard truth. That night, I sat alone on the porch and looked at the moon. I started to think about my own flaws. I asked myself the question that had been haunting me. Why did I never question the lie sooner? For 20 years, I lived with a story that seemed impossible. I never asked for a test. I never demanded proof. I realized then that I was so eager to be a hero and a protector that I let my own eyes stay closed. I wanted to be the man who saved Diane, so I ignored the parts of her story that didn't make sense. My own need to be a savior had made me an easy target for her game. I wasn't just a victim of her lie. I was a prisoner of my own pride. Now, the truth was out, and I had to be a protector for real, not just for a story. I looked out into the dark shadows of the yard, knowing that being a dad was about more than blood. It was about who stood their ground when the monster finally showed his face. The phone rang at midnight. It was a number I didn't know, and the voice on the other end was like cold gravel. "Meet me at the old diner parking lot in an hour," Victor said. "Come alone, or I'll go find Emma myself." My heart felt like it was freezing in my chest, but I knew I couldn't run anymore. I agreed to the meeting, but I wasn't going in without a plan. I tucked my own phone into my shirt pocket, making sure the voice recorder was turned on. I needed the world to hear what this man really was. The parking lot was dark and mostly empty. I saw a man leaning against a rusty car, his face hidden in the shadows. As I walked closer, Victor stepped into the light of a single flickering lamp. He looked even more dangerous than the photos. His eyes were narrow and mean, and he had a jagged scar on his cheek. He didn't say hello. He just pointed a finger at me and sneered. "I want my daughter," he growled. "I want money for all the years you stole from me. If you don't give me what I want, I'll make sure your perfect family is destroyed." I stood my ground, even though my legs felt weak. "She isn't your daughter," I said, my voice sounding deep and steady in the quiet night. "You terrorized her mother, and you walked away. I am the one who raised her. I am the one she calls when she is scared." Victor's face turned red with rage. He lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat. I moved quickly, blocking his arm and pushing him back. He stumbled against his car, cursing and shouting threats that made my skin crawl. He didn't know that every word of his violent talk was being captured by the phone in my pocket. "I'll kill you," he screamed, moving toward me again with his fists clenched. I didn't have to fight him for long. I had already called the private investigator, and he was waiting nearby with the police. As Victor tried to strike me again, sirens began to wail in the distance. Blue and red lights filled the parking lot, reflecting off the wet pavement. The officers jumped out of their cars and ordered Victor to get on the ground. Because he was on parole and had threatened me, they were able to put the handcuffs on him right then and there. As they led him away, Victor looked at me with pure hate. but I didn't feel afraid anymore. I felt a strange kind of peace. The monster was back in a cage, and I finally had the evidence I needed to keep him there. The house was quiet, but it was not a peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind of heavy silence that comes right before a huge storm breaks. Victor was finally behind bars, but the danger he brought had left our front door wide open. We gathered in the living room, sitting on the edge of the sofa, as if we were strangers in our own home. I looked at Diane, whose eyes were red and swollen, and then at Emma. My poor girl looked small and lost, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of her striped shirt. "It's time," I said. My voice was low, and it felt like I was pulling each word out from under a pile of stones. Diane took a shaky breath and began to speak. She didn't look at us. She looked at her own hands. She told the whole story from the very beginning. She explained that she had never been related to me by blood. The horrible story about the family secret 20 years ago was something she had made up out of pure, cold fear. She told us how Victor had hurt her and how he had promised to take her baby away the moment it was born. "I saw Thomas," Diane whispered, finally looking up at me. "I saw a man who was kind and strong. I knew that if I told him a story that made him feel responsible for us, he would never leave. I tied him to me with a lie because I didn't think a good man would stay for a stranger." Emma jumped up from the sofa, her face turning a bright, angry red. "So everything," she cried, her voice cracking. "My whole life, my birthday, who I am, it's all just a game you played?" The shock in her eyes was like a physical blow. She paced the room, shaking her head. She was angry at her mother for the lie, and she was terrified of the man who was her biological father. For a moment, I thought Emma might run out the door and never come back. But then she stopped. She looked at me, the man who had taught her to ride a bike, who had sat up with her when she had the flu, and who had just risked everything to face a monster in a dark parking lot. The anger seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a deep, sobbing need. She crossed the room in 2 steps and threw her arms around me, burying her face in my chest. "You're still my dad," she sobbed, her voice muffled by my shirt. "He has my face, but you have my heart. You're the only father I've ever had." I held her as tight as I could, my own tears finally falling. The silence was shattered, and our family was broken into pieces. But as I squeezed Emma's hand, I knew one thing was true. The lie was gone, but the love was real. The weeks that followed were slow and quiet, like the air after a long storm finally passes. The legal shields we built were now solid and strong. With the recording I made and the evidence of his threats, Victor was sent back to prison for a very long time. The fear that had lived in our house for 20 years was replaced by a strange, new peace. We didn't have to look over our shoulders at every shadow anymore. We started going to therapy together, sitting in a circle and learning how to speak without hiding. It was hard to look at Diane sometimes, knowing the depth of the game she had played. But as the layers of the lie were peeled away, I saw the scared girl she used to be. I chose to forgive her enough to try again. We weren't the same people we were before, but for the first time, we were rebuilding our lives on honest ground. We used the inheritance money, the very thing that had accidentally exposed the truth, to pay for our healing and to make our home a safe place for Emma. One evening, we sat down for a family meal. The light in the dining room felt warm, and the food smelled like home. Emma looked at me across the table, her brown eyes clear and bright. She didn't look like a girl living in a nightmare anymore. "Dad," she said softly, reaching out to take my hand. "I know we know the truth now, but I want you to promise me something. I want you to always be my dad, no matter what any paper says." I squeezed her hand, my heart feeling fuller than it ever had when I believed the lie. "I promise, Emma," I said. "I'm not going anywhere. As we ate, I realized that being a father wasn't about DNA or a family tree. For 20 years, I thought I was a father because of a secret shame, but now I knew I was a father because I chose to stay. I chose to love her every single day. The truth didn't destroy my family. It just showed me that the bonds we build with our hearts are much stronger than the ones we are born with. Choosing love over blood was the only thing that was ever real. If lies have shaped your family or kept you in the dark, remember that the truth is the only way to be truly free. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and always seek the truth, no matter how hard it might be.